The Supreme Court hears oral arguments to overturn state gay marriage bans. Could a constitutional right to gay marriage be far behind? Attorney Kyle Duncan will analyze. And later, China's infamous one-child policy is nearly 40 years old. Now a China watcher tells Congress it must end. Reggie Littlejohn joins us in studio. And Christians continue to be targeted by ISIS in Syria. The Melkite Archbishop of Aleppo joins us exclusively to discuss the dire situation. The World Over Live begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Kyle Duncan, Reggie Littlejohn, and Archbishop Jean-Clemenent Jeanbart are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's program, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo, or you can email us at worldover@EWTN.com. Let's go to the brief news from the world over this week. Pope Francis is lending his and the Church's moral authority to the political fight over climate change. On Tuesday, the Pope welcomed United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to the Holy See. The Secretary General was there to deliver the keynote address at a Vatican-sponsored conference pushing for worldwide action on climate change. Ban opened with a doomsday declaration, later reflected in a joint statement. He asserted that climate change is happening and it's the fault of humans. Ban further praised Pope Francis's moral and political leadership on the issue, as well as his forthcoming papal encyclical on the environment.
I'm sure that this encyclical will have a profound impact in the discussions of climate change. And I'm also hopeful that his address to the Joint Congress in the United States and his address in the special session, summit session of the United Nations General Assembly will have a profound impact. I counted on his moral voice, moral leadership.
Pope Francis's first-of-its-kind encyclical on the environment is due for release this summer. The Pope will address the U.S. Congress and the UN General Assembly in September during his visit to the U.S. and Cuba. Absent from the Vatican conference were scientists, politicians, or church leaders who question the evidence for climate change, human-induced or otherwise. In a related story, concerned climate change skeptics were on hand in Rome to question the claims being presented at the Vatican conference. A spokesman for the Chicago-based conservative public policy group, the Heartland Institute, said that Pope Francis, although well-meaning, is making a mistake by partnering with the United Nations on this issue.
I am concerned that his timetable for writing an encyclical and who I see that the Pope is talking to, that he may not have a chance to really look at the broader field of engineering and science that says there's not a problem. I would pray that the Pope would have discernment in looking at this problem, and that he would listen to all scientists, not just the United Nations.
The group claims that for the past 25 years, UN data on global warming has been inaccurate and is not credible on the science. They claim the UN's numbers are being used to, quote, stack the deck in favor of climate alarmism and outright corruption, end quote. Well, marriage had its day in court on Tuesday. The U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments in 4 cases to consider whether traditional marriage laws are constitutional and whether states must recognize same-sex marriages performed in other states. The High Court's decision could erase the long-standing legal definition of marriage as a union between one man and one woman. Same-sex couples can marry in 36 states and the District of Columbia. The Supreme Court's ruling is expected in June. We will analyze the oral arguments and how a constitutional right to gay marriage could affect religious freedom and more, coming up in the show. Rescue and recovery efforts are continuing in Nepal, following a 7.9 magnitude earthquake that hit the mountainous country this past Saturday. The devastation is widespread. The death toll has passed beyond 5,000, according to officials. A staggering 1.4 million are in need of food across the densely populated Kathmandu Valley. On the ground, Nepalese Bishop Paul Simic described the scene as frightening. He stressed the difficulties in the wake of the disaster, with communications crippled, roads impassable, and entire communities still cut off from aid. And Syrians remain under siege after 4 years of civil war. Human rights groups are reporting that ISIS has killed more than 2,000 people in Syria since the declaration of a caliphate last June. These killings are separate from those on the battlefield. According to its count, the British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says Islamic militants have shot, stoned, and beheaded at least 2,154 people during that time period. Another 500 believed kidnapped by ISIS remain missing and are feared dead. The watchdog group is calling for the United Nations Security Council to act and to stop the ongoing murder of the Syrian people. More on Syria, ISIS, and the desperate plight of its Christians firsthand with the Bishop of Aleppo later in the program. Meanwhile, ISIS sympathizers in Italy are now threatening violence there. Photographs allegedly taken in Italian cities, including Rome, accompanied with threatening messages, are being posted on the internet. The pictures, whose authenticity cannot be confirmed, show police vehicles and landmarks with a bit of paper in the frame. The paper has the Islamic State logo on it, the hashtagged phrase Islamic State in Rome, and a message in Italian that reads, "We are in your streets." And a curfew in Baltimore continues as thousands of police and National Guardsmen try to restore calm in the wake of urban rioting. The civil unrest began Saturday after a criminal suspect, Freddie Gray, died while in police custody. A week earlier, he had suffered injuries to his spine and larynx. In the meantime, 6 police officers have been suspended, while the cause and circumstances of Gray's injuries and his death are under investigation. Baltimore Archbishop William Lori said the violence and heightened emotions threaten to overshadow what should not be forgotten: a family's devastating loss and what he calls a grieving community's peaceful quest for answers and for justice. And new concerns for the U.S. economy this week as the country's gross domestic product came to a virtual standstill for the first quarter of 2015. A surprise to analysts, the GDP came in at just 0.2%. That's about a point lower than what economists predicted. The Federal Reserve shrugged off the news and left its key interest rate at near zero. They appear to be hedging against a possible rate hike later this year. And it appears the war on women mantra will be carried into the 2016 presidential race. This past week at the Women of the World Summit, Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton lamented that women are still being denied critical access to reproductive health care and safe childbirth. She put the blame squarely on culture and religion.
All the laws we've passed don't count for much if they're not enforced. Rights have to exist in practice, not just on paper. Laws have to be backed up with resources and political will. And deep-seated cultural codes, religious beliefs, and structural biases have to be changed.
That statement unsettled some in the religious community as Clinton seemed to support government enforcement of abortion with no regard for religious belief or exemptions. And Pope Francis weighed in on women's issues this week. During his Wednesday audience, the Pope said women should be compensated equally for equal work, and that the pay disparity between men and women is, quote, pure scandal. He said equal pay would be a witness of God's blessing of marriage and the equality enjoyed by the spouses. Veering from his prepared remarks, he also warned men not to be sexist and not to make the same mistake Adam did. who blamed Eve for making him consume the forbidden fruit. And longtime spokesman for the U.S. Bishops' Conference, Sister Mary Ann Walsh, passed away on Tuesday after a battle with breast cancer. She was 67. Sister Mary Ann, as she was called, was well known within Catholic media, having served the conference's communications department for 20 years until her retirement last summer. She was the first woman to serve as Director of Media Relations for the bishops. May she rest in peace. When we return, is the Supreme Court about to redefine marriage? Attorney Kyle Duncan will join me on set to discuss. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
The question is, who gets to decide the meaning of marriage? Is it people acting through the democratic process, or is it the federal courts? And our position has been, it's the people.
The court, absolutely, it's their job to make sure that every individual's liberty and equality is protected, regardless of state laws.
Those were the attorneys on both sides of the gay marriage case currently before the Supreme Court. John Bursch arguing on behalf of the states, trying to restrict the definition of marriage to one man and one woman, and Mary Bonuato, who's representing the plaintiffs seeking a constitutional right to gay marriage. Joining us to analyze the oral arguments at the High Court this week is the original lead counsel for the Hobby Lobby religious freedom case, former attorney at the Becket Fund, and an attorney who filed an amicus brief on behalf of several states, Kyle Duncan. Kyle, thanks for being here.
Nice to be here, Ron.
Now, I want to get right into these sound bites of some of these oral arguments and get your reaction as we go along. Okay. Some of the justices voiced concerns about changing the definition of marriage. They questioned whether this was a definition the court could change. Now, this is Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kennedy. Listen.
Every definition that I looked up prior to about a dozen years ago defined marriage as unity between a man and a woman as husband and wife. Obviously, if you succeed, that core definition will no longer be operable.
This definition has been with us for millennia, and it's very difficult for the court to say, oh, well, we know better.
Now, this point was also echoed by Justice Scalia, and he said up until 2001 in the Netherlands, no one could point to a country that had actually validated same-sex marriage. Where does this leave us? What does legalizing gay marriage change?
It changes the definition of marriage. It changes the bedrock definition of marriage. It changes what it means. And as the justices were pointing out there, before 2001 in the Netherlands and before 2003 in Massachusetts, no state and no country had ever recognized this new form of marriage. And so I think many of the justices expressed deep skepticism about their own authority to enact such a change, as if there were some sort of super legislature instead of a court of law.
Yeah, there was some hesitancy on the part of the justices. Even the more liberal wing of the court, Justice Breyer, expressed reservations about the courts stepping in and forcing states to accept gay marriage, getting ahead, if you will, of the legitimate political process. Where's that hesitation coming from?
I think that hesitation is coming from the fact that you already have a political process going on in this country in which proponents of same-sex marriage have won some really stunning victories in many states, in something like 11 or 12 states. And the court is sitting there looking at that thinking, well, what gives us the authority to sort of interrupt that political process? What Chief Justice Roberts at one point says, how can we shut down the debate and close minds on this issue by simply decreeing what our own personal view of the institution is?
I want to move on. There was an exchange about the consequences of changing the meaning of marriage and the state's intentions. This is John Bursch arguing on behalf of the states. Listen to Justice Kagan's response.
We want to encourage children to be bonded to their biological mother and father.
Is difficult for some people with your argument is that it's hard to see how permitting same-sex marriage discourages people from being bonded with their biological children.
If you're changing the meaning of marriage from one where it's based on that biological bond to one where it's based on emotional commitment, then adults could think, rightly, that this relationship is more about the adults and not about the kids.
Is this a convincing argument? to your ears as an attorney?
I think the more convincing argument is that when you take an age-old definition of marriage, an age-old bedrock social institution, and you just change it, no one can possibly predict with any degree of confidence what are all the ramifications for our society that are going to take place. No one, for instance, could have predicted all of the social pathologies that resulted from no-fault divorce, which at the time many people were saying, oh, well, this will strengthen marriage, this will help children. We now know the opposite. This is a far more radical change than no-fault divorce, and no one can possibly say, I know what's going to happen. No one has a crystal ball and say, here's what will happen, here's who it will harm. And I actually think what Justice Kagan says there is the wrong question. I think it's wrong to make the states say, well, prove to me what might happen in the future that's bad. No one can possibly prove that. The right view, which is the view that we expressed in our amicus brief for the states, was that this is an issue that's traditionally been left up to state citizens who deliberate about what their view of marriage is, what their view of the historic definition of marriage is, and what their view of equality is. That's what Justice Kennedy wrote in the Windsor opinion, after all, 2 years ago. And I think you heard some skepticism from the court based on this idea that you can't possibly know what the court would have wrought if it changes the definition of marriage.
But what about that argument? Because he's clearly making the case here that there's a state's interest in protecting marriage and this definition of marriage because of the children involved, and that the institution's there to serve, if you will, the children and therefore the future of society.
I think that's always been a major part of marriage, of linking children to their biological parents.
I feel a but coming on, but
as far as predicting, what's going to happen if we change one thing or how are people going to react, that's up to the citizens of the states to decide. It is what has happened, for instance, in 2011, the people of New York decided, well, we think that the definition of marriage has evolved in our communities, and so we're going to open up the definition a little bit broader. It is the right of the people of New York to do that, but it's also the right of the people of Louisiana or Oregon or Washington or Texas or what have you to come to a different view about what the definition and what the meaning and the social meaning of marriage is.
But how then do you get around equal protection? How do you get around that? If my wife and I are married in Louisiana and we travel to California, our marriage is recognized in California. You've got people who are illicitly married in the state of Massachusetts with the consent of those people who then travel to Louisiana. Well, their marriage is not recognized.
That's right. The states.
Isn't that a strong constitutional point?
Well, that's the second question in the case, and it really goes to what's called the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, which Justice Scalia brought up at the beginning of the argument, and that is a clause that has not gotten much attention. It's interesting that the plaintiffs are not basing their arguments on the full faith.
They're not citing it at all.
They're not, and they're doing it for good reason, because no court has ever held that one state must automatically recognize the marriage of another state. It typically happens because the states have largely been in the same ballpark when it comes to marriage, and they differ sometimes at the margins. But it's always been recognized that states have the authority to say, no, you've gone too far. It doesn't happen often. But here what you have is a novel revolution in the definition of marriage that has occurred over the process of, what, 5, 7, 8 years? And so it's understandable that states would say, wait a second, the other states are going too far, and our public policies are completely opposed to this.
I want to play this for you. This is Justice Scalia, Antonin Scalia. He raised this point about clergy who refuse to perform gay marriages on religious grounds, based on religious grounds. Would they be allowed to refuse gay marriages if this became legal under the Constitution? Listen.
I'm concerned about the wisdom of this court imposing through the Constitution a requirement of action which is unpalatable to many of our citizens for religious reasons. Were the states to adopt it by law, they could make exceptions to what is required for same-sex marriage. Once it's made a matter of constitutional law, is it conceivable that a minister who is authorized by the state to conduct marriage can decline to marry two men if indeed this court holds that they have a constitutional right to marry.
Your Honor, of course the Constitution will continue to apply, and right to this day, no clergy is forced to marry any couple that they don't want to marry. We have those protections.
But right to this day, we have never held that there is a constitutional right for these two people to marry, and the minister is, to the extent he's conducting a civil marriage, he's an instrument of the state. I don't see how you could possibly allow that minister to say, I will only marry a man and a woman, I will not marry two men.
You've done a lot of litigation in this religious freedom area. What is the implication of allowing this, this thing to become constitutional, gay marriage to become the law of the land?
This is the elephant in the room, Raymond. What Justice Scalia is getting at is the court essentially, if it recognizes a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, is it at the same time printing a license to persecute and discriminate against Christian schools or any other religious believers who hold to the traditional definition of marriage? So Justice Scalia used the example of a minister who's being forced to officiate at a gay wedding. Now, that one probably, we hope, is covered by the First Amendment. The First Amendment would prevent that from happening. But we see all sorts of disputes now breaking out in states like Indiana and other states with bakers and florists. And it's important to recognize what's at stake in those disputes. What is at stake is not, can they refuse service to gay people, as if they want to put up a sign that says no gay people allowed. No one wants to do that. That's silly. No one's arguing for that. The argument is, can you force people to participate in a gay wedding against their conscience? That's the issue.
But the people on the receiving end of that would say, it doesn't matter how you justify it in your head, the outcome is the same. You're discriminating, you're not serving gay people.
You're not what I think.
You're justifying it as I'm not doing this on religious grounds. I'm not taking part in your marriage, so I won't bake the cake. But to the person asking for the cake, they're saying, you're discriminating against me because I'm gay and I'm in this gay marriage.
So, for example, the cake baker and the florist in these cases already was serving gay people. There's no question about discriminating against gay people.
But when gay people
the line
want to marry,
gets drawn, yes, because they're being asked to participate in the ceremony. And one would have hoped, before all these controversies developed, that all Americans of goodwill could have had a live and let live attitude. You get married, but don't make me come to the wedding. Don't make me participate in the wedding. And now we're seeing that this consensus was very fragile and is breaking down rapidly. And the point is up until now, the court has not recognized a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. If it does so, is it printing a license to persecute churches? And I think from comments by the Solicitor General of the United States, Christian schools and people need to be afraid of that.
What did he say?
He responded to a question from Justice Alito, who asked him, if we recognize the constitutional right, could the federal government remove the tax exemptions of, for example, a Christian school that continue to adhere to the traditional definition of marriage? And the Solicitor General wouldn't say no. He said he'd have to know more about it, but he said it would be an issue. Now, that should frighten, and frighten is the right word, any Christian church, school, and for that matter, Jewish or Muslim or anybody, any religious group that holds to the traditional definition of marriage that every state had recognized before 2003, every one of those groups should be afraid that the government will now view them as open season on them because of their now unconstitutional view on marriage.
Justice Roberts made the point, and I think when you look at the polling data, the point is abundant. You're pushing 60% approval of gay marriage in the United States, according to these polls, moving into the 60% range on some of them, but above 50 in a lot of them. The Chief Justice said, look, he was amazed at how quickly this has happened, the speed with which this has moved from opposition to acceptance of gay marriage. What happened to cause that, in your estimation?
I have no idea, but I think...
No idea?
I have no idea, but however, someone said something about statistics. I don't remember what the quote is exactly, but it has to do with lies. Here's a better statistic. If the courts were not forcing the states to recognize same-sex marriage. You might have same-sex marriage in 11 or 12 states in the District of Columbia, but you wouldn't have it in 2/3 of the states. That seems to me a much more reliable indication of where people actually are on this issue. Sure, have more welcoming and understanding attitudes toward gays and lesbians. Sure, that makes sense to me. But the idea that that translates into an unquestioned acceptance of gay marriage, I don't see any evidence for that. What I see is a minority of states that adopted it over a very short period of time, but that 2/3 of the states still don't. And you have the federal courts trying to push this issue and effectively doing it.
Kyle, you have Quinnipiac's poll, hardly a liberal polling company. Republicans are at 33%, 59% are still opposing. Democrats, 74% to 22% opposed. But overall, 58% of Americans are saying, do you support or oppose allowing same-sex couples to get married?
Then what?
It's a pretty straight question. What ABC, Wall Street Journal, same thing, 61% approval.
What do you need courts for then? If people are supporting it to that extent, why do the courts have to come in and protect minorities
that was the
who have
Roberts
such
point.
Political power?
Let it happen in the states was their point.
That's the point we make in our brief for the states. Why not let the people work this out instead of recognizing a constitutional right and printing a license to persecute Christian and Jewish and Muslim believers who take a different view?
I want to get this quote in. It's very important. Justice Sam Alito suggested that under the Constitution, marriage between two people of the same sex represents a substantial break with what we have today, which could lead to other types of marriages. Listen.
These are four people, two men and two women. It's not the sort of polygamous relationship, polygamous marriages that existed in other societies and still exist in some societies today. And let's say they're all consenting adults, highly educated. What would be the logic of denying them the same right?
How far is this going, do you imagine? If we are to see in the coming days, by June, the Supreme Court decide there is a constitutional right to gay marriage, does this open the door to these other relationships?
I have no idea. I hear news reports about, for instance, California recognizing that a child could have 3 genetic parents. I've heard that in Great Britain as well. Justice Alito's point is about logic. He was simply asking the question of what principle in logic or in law can the plaintiffs identify that would distinguish their situation from 3 or 4 person marriages. And I think if you look at the transcript, you won't see an answer to that question. You'll see the plaintiffs waving their hands vaguely at sort of the states may have interests, but the states are talking about their interests now with respect to same-sex marriage. When the polygamy case comes up and the states talk about their interests, are they going to be laughed out of court the way that their interests have been laughed out of court in these cases?
Put your prognosticator hat on. Where does this go? Given what you heard, given where everybody is, what you heard from Justice Kennedy, it was clearly the swing vote here, what happens?
Justice Kennedy is sending conflicting messages, I think, as everyone is recognizing. And that doesn't mean he's necessarily conflicted on the matter. I don't know what his mind is on the matter. But he's asking hard questions of both sides. So I don't think you can predict on the basis of oral arguments what's going to happen. I think it's safe to say it's going to be a 5-4 decision one way or the other. But I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know.
So you're not saying, you don't, do you believe it's leaning toward allowing the states to do this and not granting a full constitutional right? What's your best guess?
You know, based on what the courts are courts of precedent, right? They look to what they've decided in the past. Right. 2 years ago, in the Windsor case, Justice Kennedy wrote that the federal government cannot have a national definition of marriage because it's always been up to the states to come up with their own definition of marriage, and some states have kept the traditional definition, and other states like New York, for instance, in 2011, adopted same-sex marriage. Now, if this is based on logic and reason and precedent, I don't see how the states could lose. Now, if it's based on something else, then I can't confidently predict what the outcome's going to be. But if it's based on precedent, which is what I thought we lawyers were supposed to look to, then I don't see how Justice Kennedy could recognize the states get to define it 2 years ago and now say, but the court gets to define it now.
Kyle Duncan, we'll see what happens in June. Thank you for being here. When we return, why is China's one-child policy still in place after 40 years? My next guest calls it a gendercide, and she told Congress so much this week. Reggie Littlejohn joins us after the break. Come back.
One case that I'll never forget is of a young woman who was 7 months pregnant, who was walking down the street, and she was grabbed by family planning cadres, dragged off the street, strapped down to a table, forced to abort the baby that she very desperately wanted. And in the end, one of the medical personnel came to her with the body of her aborted baby and said, "You need to pay for this so that we can dispose of the body." And she said she didn't have any money, so they just laid that body right next to her in the bed. And I've got a photograph of her looking down and just grieving the loss of this 7-month-old baby that was forcibly aborted.
She has long sounded the alarm about China's one-child policy. It's been called the world's largest social experiment. She calls it a gendercide. Here with the latest is human rights activist and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, REGGIE LITTLEJOHN. REGGIE, great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
This is nearly 35 years old this year,
That's
this
right.
one-child policy. What is the problem, and why hasn't the world taken notice of so many missing girls?
Well, there is a twofold problem here, Raymond. First of all, there is the issue of government-enforced forced abortion. So they have this one-child policy, and it means if you have more than one child, if you don't have a birth permit, you will end up with a forced abortion. And the Chinese Communist Party boasts that they have prevented 400 million lives through the one-child policy. So China is unique in having a governmental enforced coercive low birth limit. But there's also the issue of gendercide, the sex-selective abortion of baby girls. So people feel that if they can only have one child or 2 children at the most, they want their only child or definitely one of their 2 children to be a girl and a boy. So they selectively abort the girls.
In 2013, the Chinese government tweaked the one-child policy, which allowed people to, if you had a girl the first time out, you could have a second child. How did that affect society, and what was the outcome there?
In the countryside, if your first child is a girl, you can have a second child. And most people see that as their last opportunity to have a boy, and that's where the gendercide happens. The most vulnerable people in China are the second girls born in the countryside. And there are 9 provinces in which there are 140 boys born for every 100 girls born, and 2 provinces in which there's actually 190 boys born for every 100 girls born on that second child.
How has this changed Chinese society? And what is it setting up?
Well, because of the sex-selective abortion of baby girls and the preference for boys, China now has a very critical gender imbalance where there are at least 37 million more men living there than women. And what that has done is it's provided the driving force, the engine, if you will, for a tsunami of sexual slavery, not only in China, but the surrounding countries as well.
Wow. So, and they're importing people from other countries, women from other countries?
Yes.
To mate with these, to marry these men?
There's forced marriage, and then there's just sexual slavery. And yes, women are being seduced and trafficked across international borders. Many women are told, we're going to get you a great job in China, you're going to work in this wonderful factory, you're going to be able to make money, you're going to be able to send money home, and then they come over the border and then either they're into forced brides or sexual slavery.
I was surprised to learn in some of your research that China has one of the highest female suicide rates anywhere. It's unbelievable.
China has the highest female suicide rate in the world, and it's increasing. So at this point now, 590 women a day are killing themselves in China. Wow. And it's possibly the only country or one of 2 countries where the suicide rate for women is higher than men, and in the countryside it's 3 times the number of women as men kill themselves.
Where are the women's groups on this? Why aren't we hearing more about this? Forget abortion or certain rights. Why aren't we looking at this as just the extermination of women for being women?
You know something? I agree with you. It seems to me, and I challenge the pro-life community has really embraced my message. I challenge the pro-choice and the women's groups. If they are pro-choice, they should be jumping up and down against forced abortion. If they care about women's rights, they should care about the selective extermination of 200 million women worldwide. If they care about women's so-called reproductive health, why don't they care about 200 million forced sterilizations of women in China?
Why don't the leaders in China repeal this thing, given all of these unintended consequences that we're seeing all around?
Well, yes. The one that we've talked about is the gender imbalance. The other one that we haven't talked about yet is the aging of Chinese society. Yeah. So they started this whole policy because in the Mao era, there was a very high fertility rate of almost 6 kids per woman. So they instituted the one-child policy. Now it's down to about 1.5 children per woman. But the problem is that population explosion under the Mao era is now heading towards retirement, and they do not have a young population to sustain it. So the problem in China is not that they have too many people, it's that they have too few young people to sustain their elderly population and too few women. So why do they keep the policy, as you ask? In my opinion, and this is what I testified about today, China is keeping the one-child policy because the one-child policy is keeping the Chinese government in power.
How so?
Because in the beginning, I believe that it really was a population control measure and that the terror of forced abortion was a byproduct. At this point, it makes no demographic sense whatsoever for them to keep the policy. So why are they doing it? The Chinese government is a brutal, totalitarian regime, and the one-child policy is a way for them to demonstrate their power and intimidate everyone. It's a way for their arm to reach from Beijing into every single womb in the entire nation of China and declare life or death over the baby that's in there. And that is a way that they can keep it's basically social control masquerading as population control.
It's terrifying. Your organization has a initiative called Save a Girl.
Yes.
Tell me about this. It's already launched in China. You're soon going to be branching out, or you just have, in India. Tell me about the program.
Well, our Save a Girl program is, we have a network of field workers on the ground inside of China, and we actually have connections in the community, including even in the local hospital and some of the clinics, where when a woman goes in and has an ultrasound and knows that she has a girl and has scheduled herself for an abortion because she's a girl, or when she's given birth to a girl and we find out that she's being pressured by her in-laws to abandon that baby girl, we will actually go to her door and say, please do not abort, please do not abandon your baby because she's a girl. We will give you a year of monthly support to help you, to empower you to keep your daughter.
And you're working through local people in country, in China.
Exactly, right. But it's a way for people in the United States to extend a helping hand directly to the door of somebody in China who is being really coerced. There's a strong correlation between gendercide and forced abortion because gendercide is almost like family or culturally enforced abortion. To help a woman who is carrying a girl and everybody's telling her to abort her, to say, no, don't do that. She's a precious daughter, and we will give you financial support to help you keep her. And we have a very high success rate.
Reggie, for you, I know this is not a concept or a theory. This is something that is a daily part of your life. You have 2 adopted daughters from China. Tell me about that, how that happened and what this has meant to your life.
There is a very brave and famous activist in China named Zhang Lin. He is a former nuclear physicist who gave up what would have been a life of privilege to demonstrate for democracy in connection with the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement. And for that reason, he was jailed, tortured, and his health has been broken. They've broken discs in his back. They've tromped on his hands because he's a blogger and a writer. And when they could not silence him by directly jailing and persecuting him, they actually went after his 10-year-old daughter, Annie. And when she was in 4th grade, she was kidnapped out of her elementary school and detained overnight. So she's known as China's youngest prisoner of conscience. And then they didn't allow her to go to school. They put her and her father under house arrest. They escaped and became fugitives. Then they were caught, and when they were caught, her father knew he was going to be going back in detention, so he got word out to me saying, please help. We want Annie to come to the United States because she can't lead a normal life in China. So with the help of Congressman Chris Smith and very brave people in China and the United States, we were able to get Annie to the United States. And now my husband and I are raising her and her older sister as our own daughters.
Wow, unbelievable. How long have you been raising
They came
girls?
in September of 2013. So we've had them for about a year and a half now. And Annie has gone from somebody who doesn't speak any English at all to her first report card as a straight A student we just got 2 days ago. And her sister Lily is turning 21, and she's gone from speaking very little English to actually she's learned to drive, she's passed her GED, she's got her job doing real estate, and she's on her feet and ready to become independent. So we're very proud of both of our girls who are the daughters of Zhang Lin.
2 girls you've saved, certainly, in a big way. Before I let you go, we saw earlier in the program the Pope this week had this international confab at the Vatican with the UN to really embrace an agenda for climate change, and he's asking the global community to put restrictions on carbon emissions and to really raise this issue up as a moral concern. Do you have any concerns, knowing what you do of the UN and the way it operates? Do you have any concerns about the broad embrace of this climate change initiative?
Well, you know, I'm glad you asked that. I'm an outdoors woman, and I'm all in favor of the environment. I believe that we should protect God's creation. However, I think that the Pope needs to be aware of the fact that that issue and the fact that everybody has an emotional response to natural beauty can be corrupted into actually a bottom line for a lot of people, which is a lot of the people who are driving this climate change are actually really what they're into is population control. So, for example, how does that have anything to do with China? There was a climate change summit in Copenhagen. That's right. And one of the top leaders of the Chinese Communist Party's Family Planning Commission got up there and said, proudly, we have prevented 400 million lives from being born, and this is our contribution to the fight against global warming. And most of that was done through forced abortion. So we really have to guard against viewing human beings as walking carbon footprints. We cannot fall into that trap.
Yeah, and this declaration that humans contribute to and are the reason for climate change, which was part of the joint declaration this week, concerning?
You know something, I would have to really do a lot more research on the science for that. I know that there's been a lot of discrediting of that position in the press lately. But what I will say is this, in terms of human beings causing climate change, the Chinese Communist Party is rapacious. I'm telling you, they are rapacious towards the environment, and they will do things like dumping cadmium right into rivers, et cetera, et cetera. So they say, oh, we've done this great job helping the world by eliminating 400 million lives, but they have no controls, and so to me, it's not a matter of depopulating the world. It's a matter of being sensitive in the way that you use the environment. And also, you know, I would challenge some of these people who are the top climate change advocates. How are they living? What kind of resources are they using? Yeah. How many jets are they flying where they want to go somewhere and they use a whole jet to get themselves there? How many rooms are in their household? You know, I just think we need to look at that as well.
Yeah, and not always focus on the population as somehow being a parasite on the earth. Reggie Littlejohn, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You can learn more about Reggie Littlejohn's Save a Girl initiative and find out how to help by visiting womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org. When we return, Melkite Archbishop Jean-CLEMENT Jeanbart of Aleppo is here to tell us about his suffering flock in Syria and how you can assist them. The World Over continues in a moment. Stay right there.
We have sat in this chamber many times
and borne witness to the spiralling violence and growing despair in the country. The government, armed and terrorist groups continue to kill, maim, rape, torture, and take Syria to new lows that seemed unimaginable a few years ago.
Welcome back to The World Over. That was Valerie Amos, the UN Undersecretary General, talking about the spiral of violence in Syria, where Christians and Muslims are fighting for their lives in the face of kidnappings, bombings, and the 4-year-old conflict between the Assad regime and ISIS-backed rebels, as well as other insurgents. My next guest is the Melkite Archbishop of Aleppo, Syria, the leader of a community literally fighting for its life in what is the cradle of Christianity. He's in the United States this week on a mission to raise awareness about his suffering people. Please welcome Archbishop Jean-Clemenent Jeanbart, joining us via satellite from New York City. Archbishop, thank you for being here.
Yeah, man. Thank you for accommodating me.
And now you are encouraging your clergy, your priests, to remain in Syria despite the terrible violence we're watching unfold every day. Why do that, and at what risk are they?
Why do that? Because it is our country. We have been living in this country since the beginning of the history of the new era of Christianism. Our first ancestors were baptized the Pentecost Day in Jerusalem while they were in pilgrimage, and they came back in Syria with the new faith, with their faith in Jesus Christ. And we have to remain, to continue, to persevere, to bring witness to the Lord, where the church was born and where millions of martyrs, innocent martyrs, for their faith, shed their blood and irrigated this land, this holy land. Syria is a holy land because it has received the blood of millions and millions of martyrs.
Your Excellency,
it is enough reason for us to stay and to remain and to fight to remain.
Your Excellency, a Greek as well as a Syriac Orthodox bishop were kidnapped and they are still missing. It has been 2 years. Do you worry about your own life, that you might be subject to kidnapping, should you return, and when do you return?
Of course, we are always preoccupied, and we are afraid that some harm may happen to one of ourselves, us, myself, other colleagues, priests, but we rely on the blessing and protection of the Lord. We do not make harm to anyone. We are people who want peace, who push toward peace, toward dialogue, toward understanding between all factions. We look for a political solution. We call for dialogue. We ask nations to help us find peace by pushing all parties to sit on a table and discuss their problems together and find a way to establish peace and understanding between all citizens in the country.
I want to play something for you. This is President Assad of Syria talking about terrorism, and I wonder if you agree with this analysis. Listen.
As long as many European officials still adulating countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar just for their money and selling their values, and allow the Wahhabi dark ideology to infiltrate and instilled some communities in Europe, we have to expect more attacks in that regard.
Do you agree with that analysis?
I am afraid that part of it is exact, and but I mustn't interfere in politics. I do not want to give an opinion, but it is right that there are interferences
and there are, yes, from Western country and other countries, there are there are immersion and action on our country. I will not make analysis. I do not have to have any position on that regard.
Last week, Republicans and Democrats here on Capitol Hill in the Senate are urging the United States to, with their allies, create safety zones within Syria for the fledgling Christian population and so many other minorities looking for a safe haven. Is that a good idea, one you support?
I'm afraid that it is not, because it will be a target and it will create new division in the country. What is the best would be to make all parties find and sit together and find a solution. This kind of solution would push the war for years and years to continue in the future. We need an immediate solution. The preoccupation of our people and our preoccupation or our fears are the future. And to have some confidence in the future and to be tranquil that tomorrow will be better, we must go straight on to find a solution, not a provisory diminishing of what is happening.
Your Excellency, the big difficulty is how do you dialogue with people who are kidnapping, raping, selling women into sex slavery, attacking churches and your residents? How do you dialogue with people like this?
I'm afraid that these people are not Syrians. Syrian people wouldn't, any Syrian people, man or woman, any Muslim of Syria wouldn't do what are doing ISIS. So we have not to dialogue with them. They are not of the country, they are foreigners. They have to go back to their countries to leave us, resolve our problems between ourselves, between our brothers, Syrian citizens, Muslim, Christians, Alawite, Durzi, all of them. We have not to dialogue with people who are not from this country and who do not know our language neither. I'm afraid they do not speak even Arabic. Many of them do not speak Arabic. They do not know what it is, what they are doing and what it is about.
Nonetheless, this is the source of so much of the conflict, and that's, some are asking, where is the UN in all of this? That Angelina Jolie went before the UN this week and was urging it to use its security powers to do something in the region, to at least stop the hemorrhage of violence we're seeing all over the region. Would you support that? Do you think the UN's doing enough?
About the conflict
I agree that the UN is not doing enough. And UN should make pressure that this slaughtering and this violence may stop. How, I will not know, I cannot say how, but they can find a way. They can find numerous countries who would agree to cooperate to make an end to all what is happening.
Your Excellency, give us a sense of what it looks like from the ground. I mean, when you read these numbers, it is staggering. More than 200,000 Syrians killed in the last 4 years. Hundreds of Christians, 107 churches destroyed. There's not electricity in areas. There's difficulty finding water. What impact has this had on your people, and what are you asking for as far as relief and aid?
It is obvious that my people suffer a lot of that, and it makes my people despair, see that the future is very dark, and they are afraid of what will happen later. They suffer lack of electricity, of water, and destruction, and churches distracted, and people killed, innocent killed, kidnapped, other kidnapped, and as you said, 200,000 people killed. And this is terrible, and we feel miserable with all this.
What would you like people around the world to do in response?
I don't know what people around the world can do. It is up to the governments and up to the, head of peoples to do. People could perhaps make pressure on their governments, of their presidents, or their decision maker to do something and to help reaching peace. Mm-hmm. They can do also help our people, help the needs of our people. Mm-hmm. They can raise funds and help to feed people, to take care of the sick, and take care also of the pupils of schools, to help them to continue to study, to restore houses, demolished houses, and hospitals. Mm-hmm. Perhaps also people around the world and people of goodwill could do all these things, mm-hmm. making pressure on their governments to do something and helping, offering some, money to help our people live and go out of its misery.
Archbishop Jeanbart, thank you so much for being here, and we will certainly encourage our viewers to help the people with aid, which is what they're in such need of at this moment. Thank you so much, Your Excellency.
Yes, sir.
For more information on the plight of Christians in Syria and how you can help support the Archbishop's work, visit Aid to the Church in Need. Their website is churchinneed.org. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. You can also sign up for my free e-blast. I'll send you exclusive news you won't find anywhere else and links to the show segments each week. Now, don't miss next week's show. Deacon Larry Oney will join us to discuss his plans for inner city renewal. It's a real response to what we've been seeing on the streets of Baltimore and elsewhere. And next week is Children's Book Week. To celebrate, Peter Larangas is here. He's the author of the 7 Wonders series, so get your middle grade readers ready. Until next time, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thanks for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. We'll see you next time. Bye now.